promoting mindful well-being in everyday life. This is the Pragmatic Alchemy Podcast with your host, Courtney Edwards.
Hi, everybody. I'm Courtney Edwards, and you're listening to the Pragmatic Alchemy Podcast. Today, we are welcoming Aly Bird to the show. Aly is a counselor in training. She's Canadian. She's an author, and she's a coach, and she's a widow. Her book called Grief Ally: Helping People You Love Cope with Death, Loss, and Grief is shaped by her experience of losing her partner a few years ago. So we're going to talk about Aly's grief experience, and we're going to talk about what she learned along the way and this how-to guide that she created not for the bereaved, but for those of us who are witnessing someone we love go through the grief experience. We get a little bit philosophical. We talk about why in Western cultures we're so hesitant to talk about death and loss and grief. Some of the things that we have internalized from societal expectations that make this conversation so taboo, despite the fact that it is so universally true. As Aly points out at one point in our conversation, the only two facts of life are that we will live and we will die. Everything else in between there is, it might happen, it might not. But those two things are true, and yet we don't want to talk about death. We don't want to talk about loss, and we don't want to talk about grief. And we don't know how to be good allies to others during their grief experience. So hopefully this conversation is helpful to you, particularly if you're in the presence of somebody who's currently experiencing a loss. Aly's gift to the world is coming from a deep place of sorrow, but that is the spirit of pragmatic alchemy, isn't it? So I'm so delighted to share this conversation with you, and I'm so grateful that Aly took the time to sit down with me and talk about this important topic. So let's get started. Hi, Aly. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you, Courtney. I'm happy to be here.
I'm so excited to have this conversation, which probably sounds a little bit weird considering that we're going to talk a lot about grief. But I'm kind of hoping that by instilling some excitement into this conversation, maybe it'll help take away all of the taboo that makes talking about grief and grief experiences so hard, despite the fact that it's something that we all endure, experience, witness throughout our lives. But before I talk a lot, I want the people to know about you and the work that you do. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do and your book?
Yeah. So my name is Aly Bird. I am a coach. I have a master's in social planning. And I'm also a therapist in training. But more recently, in 2019, I became a widow. And that experience with grief has taught me so much that I wrote a book about how to help the people they love cope with death, loss, and grief. Yeah. And I found on the market that there wasn't a resource for people's support networks. There's a lot of books that are written for people like me who are really at the heart of something sad and tragic, but there isn't a tool out there for people who have the capacity to learn new skills and who are looking for answers to what do I do and how do I help. And so my book, Grief Ally: How to Help People You Love Cope with Death, Loss, and Grief was born. And that's what I'm working on right now.
Excellent. You took one of my first questions right off the table with that explanation, which was, I was curious when I was looking through everything, why the book was geared towards the helpers and not a book for the bereaved. But I think you explained that really well. Go ahead.
Yeah, I can add to that too. And
Yeah.
I think this is really an important part of my story is that very early in my journey of grief, there was a grief expert, so to speak, who suggested that I try and go find community, try and find people like me. And so I joined 13 different Facebook groups. And before, sharing my story, I just observed a little bit. And what I observed was that there was so much expression of abandonment and being misunderstood and feeling forgotten from my peers that I didn't resonate with. I actually felt very loved and supported and heard and witnessed through my community, through my chosen family, through the people that loved me, that I couldn't relate. And it hurt my heart that other people weren't being able to experience that. So I wanted to really create a tool so that people didn't have to, go search for these communities and vent about, this hardship that they felt that they were enduring alone. So I took the lessons that my support network and I learned through my experience and put it into the book.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate the depth of that. So you were joining these groups and you were finding folks that were being asked, I'm sure, thinking about the way I've responded to people in grief experiences, what do you need? How can I help? Right.
100%.
And then you're like, well, I'm reeling. Like I'm just trying to breathe right now. And you're asking me what I need and I can't form a thought. Yeah. Which is such a
100%.
burden, right? Yeah.
It is. And it asks a lot of someone whose brain and body probably feel quite foreign in that moment, especially if the loss was unexpected or sudden, and asking them to have more agency than they probably have in that moment. That's asking someone to do a lot. Yes.
Right. Well, and it's funny, I'm married and I have a couple of kids, and I feel like there's times where my husband will be like, well, what can I do to help you? And I'm like, I can't make another decision. And I'm not even dealing with a catastrophe. I'm dealing with dinner, right? And like working and life. And even in that moment, I can remember saying to him at different times, like, I literally cannot make another decision right now because I'm at max capacity. And so to think about how that just happens in our day, right? To then imagine these inconceivable moments in time where your life just pivoted in a way that felt so, unanticipated. You didn't even know that was coming.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
exactly. And that's something that I really try to instill in the conversations that I have with people, is that instead of putting out there like, call me if you need anything,
Mm-hmm.
uh, what can I do to help?
Mm-hmm.
The best thing that you can do is kind of pause and ask yourself is like, how can I make this person's life easier and more comfortable?
Mm.
Because grief is exhausting. It lasts forever. You can't fix it. So the only real agency that anyone in a support role has is making that person's life easier and more comfortable. And within that, I am a firm believer that you don't have to be everything for someone. So, sure, yeah, maybe making meals would make that person's life easier. But if you are not a great cook, you're not someone who likes to spend time in the kitchen, you don't necessarily have to do that either. Like, that person has a support team and has a countless people with all different sorts of skills. So figure out, do some reflection, like what assets, what strengths do you have, and then offer that to the person.
Mm.
So, I have a friend who's not a kitchen person. Like she, like in the immediacy of my partner's death, she showed up with Kleenex and crackers and is like, I don't know what to do. But she is an amazing writer and editor and note taker. So that's where I gave her a role. She's like, I will take notes for you. And I'm like, great, done. Like,
Mm-hmm.
be on this phone call with me and take notes because my brain isn't working in the way that I know it can or that it once did. So there's a role for everyone in terms of making someone's life easier and more comfortable. That is actually help and takes the burden off of the bereaved.
Right. Yeah, it seems so simple and straightforward, right? Think about what you're good at and do that. But
Yeah.
yeah, we don't think about it. And I guess maybe this is going to be perhaps a big question, but it feels like the most resonant starting point for me. We all will grieve in our lives, and yet it is so often treated like this thing that happens to other people. We're so uncomfortable around it. We don't want to talk about it. The whole thing is just very kind of clandestine in the shadows. Maybe if I don't say it out loud, it won't happen to me. Like, I don't really know what underlies all that. So I'm just curious what your take is on our societal stuff with grief. I know. And I'll also, just so you could, I'll caveat, I don't know if grief is handled very differently in Canada than it is in the United States. So there may be some cultural differences there that I'm not super aware of, but you're shaking your head no, like, yeah.
I would lump it all together. I think that's fine. A North American Western worldview on grief, that's totally okay to make that statement.
Okay.
I'm sure there are many factors that relate to that. There is just an element of community care that, with the onset of capitalism and industrialization, we have become more and more individual, and in part that the pain that we endure becomes a very individual experience. We don't live in like small communities anymore or really know our neighbors, so there isn't that level of care there. There's also an element of generationally, not me personally, but our parents and grandparents endured some really intense trauma, world wars, and in those moments the mantra was, keep calm and carry on. Don't talk about it because it'll slow us down.
Right. And we were raised by these people. And so
100%.
those values were then instilled in us. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I also think too, we've done a really great job with science and technology that pain and discomfort has been kind of, engineered out of our lives. So when we do feel something uncomfortable, whether that's, a muscle ache or something, we can take something over the counter for it. And if there isn't, a tool to take the pain away, we have all sorts of numbing agents. We have drugs and alcohol and work and TV and sex and all this stuff that, so you don't have to feel it. And what grief when it finally makes its way to you is so foreign that it shocks people. But because we haven't had these role models that, grieve out in the open, it kind of continues to be hushed behind the doors. And so we carry on in this pattern of, go find community, go find the people who have experienced this thing. And it's kind of like everybody, you live in like a before and an after, before you knew loss and after you knew loss. And your social networks become very stark and different. It's actually my hope that doesn't have to be the norm anymore. Like my hope for the future is that, we can build relationships with the people that we love that are robust enough to hold us as we shift and change and cope and try to survive and adapt in the lives that, we've been dealt because of the significant losses that we've experienced.
Right. Yeah. I agree with everything that you just said.
Yeah.
And I frequently denounce capitalism on this podcast. I do. Because I just, to your point, I do feel like we have become so just resistant to discomfort.
Yes.
Just the existence of discomfort. And I understand that what you're talking about and the type of loss that you experienced goes beyond discomfort. But if we can't even as a society handle discomfort, how can we then ever be equipped to handle, capital L loss?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, there's this in addition to the capitalism and the generations of keep and calm and carry on, there's also there's like the onset of like positive thinking and like positive psychology spin on things, where it's like it's all about your mindset. And if you don't let yourself feel bad, there is no bad, which I think is also quite harmful and has done a real disservice to not giving ourselves the space to embrace those more uncomfortable emotions, whether, that be sadness or anger or, rage even. Those are really encouraged to be like hushed down, don't get too big, like stay happy, stay strong. And you're actually a less healthy human when you don't, give attention to the full spectrum of emotion that you can experience. And then when the big things do happen, the big hard things, and we haven't practiced those skills and know how to recognize those emotions and realize that they can move through you. Yes, they will exist, but they will not last forever. Then it makes for a much harder time when the really hard stuff happens.
Yeah, I agree. One of the things that I'm always curious to get people's impression on, and this is particularly relevant to you, is tell me what you think about the Kubler-Ross 5 stages of grief model.
Okay. It's great. I saw a meme the other day. It was like Kubler who? The 5 stages of loss from Kubler-Ross actually were born from a study of people who were dying, not people who were coping with the aftermath of death. Let's just start there, like just plain facts. I think, similar to relating back to what I said about how people, like, we like things that, help with that discomfort. We like the things that numb us out. We want a cure for our ailments. The desire to have something that is so linear and boxy, I think, is very, very attractive in our culture.
It's concrete, right? It's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, done. You graduated grief. Here's your gold star.
100%.
Yeah.
In reality, it is nothing like that.
Right.
It is there is nothing that could put parameters around what someone's experience of grief is, because it is so unique for each person and influenced by so many factors that there is no way that five steps, 5 stages, 5 emotions would be capable of capturing anyone's unique experience with grief.
Right.
Grief is just too complex, unfortunately. And it lasts forever. That's the reality of it, is that it's not something that you fix. It's not something that you get over or move on from. It's just something that becomes integrated into your present and you plan for in your future. And yeah, 5 steps. 5 steps will never do it justice.
Right. It's almost like a 5-part to-do list. And if I do these 5 things, I'll be okay. Yeah. And I can see why people would cling to that. I will say I have found it helpful in a different way. And that is to talk about, here are all the different emotions that you may experience. I remember I just told this story recently, and I can't remember now if it was to you when we were prepping, but I remember a friend of mine had a loss in her family, and it was a couple months had passed, and we were alone, and we were having a conversation, and she just, was becoming a little vulnerable and talking to me about her experience, and she was expressing a lot of anger and was internalizing guilt about being angry with her lost loved one. And I remember saying to her, I was like, well, so there's this 5 stages of grief model, and, I fall somewhere in the middle of its validity. I said, but anger is one of the stages. I said it's really kind of normal to feel anger at your lost loved one. And it was a simple 15-minute conversation, but I just remember her reaching out afterwards to say thank you, because she didn't know that it was okay to be angry at her lost loved one. And she was just internalizing. And I just think about how much pain that is when you're already grieving, you're missing your person, you love them so much, or you wouldn't be grieving in the first place. And now you're like beating yourself up over, like, are you doing it right? Are you grieving right? And it's
Yeah,
like, oh, no. Like, all of these feelings can come in, right? All of them, and good ones too, right? Like, you might feel gratitude and you might feel loved and supported. And those are good feelings. And they're all okay. They're all allowed. They're all normal.
absolutely. And I think just taking a few steps back, it's important to make the distinction that grief itself is more of like an internal energy that is created by a change in attachment.
Mm.
And that is the human experience of grief. We are biologically prepositioned to attach to ideas, things, places, and particularly people for our survival.
Mm-hmm.
So when that attachment changes, whether someone dies or your job changes or you move to a new home, there is a change in that attachment, and that energy that is created by that change, that is grief. That is your body shifting, changing, and transforming to move beyond that attachment and to do something else with its attachment. So grief in itself is there's a great organization called Being Here Human. They've since kind of dissolved, but they have these great phrases of that grief is involuntary and happens in our bodies without our consent. So at any change in attachment, there is grief with it. Grief itself is not emotion, but that change in attachment, that energy creates emotion within ourselves, creates these feelings. So, it can create those 5 feelings that come, or those 5 stages of grief, but also any other feeling on the feeling wheel is up for grabs in that situation.
Yeah.
And like you said, all of that is okay. It's very okay. And I think that's an important part of what I teach in the book, is that give the person that you love like the permission and empowerment and respect for the emotional experience that they are having because of their loss. Yeah.
One of the things that I love, I had a note here in my prep that says grief that doesn't include death. And so I'm really glad that you just mentioned some of those other things, because I think that too kind of messes with people when they know they're experiencing grief, but nobody died. And I think we tend to correlate grief specifically with death. And I don't know if you've also encountered that, but I feel like we can grieve any number of things.
Absolutely. It all comes down to attachment. Like that's where it is. Like, you can be attached to something you never had. You can be attached to an idea.
Right.
You can you can realize that you really wanted something and now you can't have it, and that energy that's created there, that's grief too. Or something is harder than you expected it to be.
Right.
And also too, like, grief is layered. Often when that severing of that one attachment happens, so I'll use a really simple example. Like, if you lose your car keys, it is not just the loss of your car keys. It is the loss of access to your vehicle and where your vehicle can take you. And all the things that you will miss out on because you can't drive to these different locations. So, like, there might be a place that has the best coffee and donuts, and it is the most delicious and wonderful thing in your life. And because you have lost your car keys, there has been a domino effect that says that you can now not have that coffee and donuts. And I think that's a big misconception that it isn't just one loss. It isn't just in the context of death, it's not just the death of a person and the loss of that person. It's all the things that you have lost because of that person, and all the things you cannot have because that person is now no longer here.
Mm. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And those are the things that we often miss in the ceremonies and traditions that we have. So, we have a funeral or a celebration of life to reflect on this person, but we don't have ceremonies for, when your plans to move somewhere with that person just can't happen.
Right, right. Yeah, no, that's so true. One of the things I talk about a lot on the podcast, I'm noticing, is I have a 15-year-old daughter who has Down syndrome, and she was diagnosed about 4 hours after she was born. And I, in the 15 years since, recognize that as probably the most significant grief experience of my life.
Mm-hmm.
And I had her, right? I still have her. Like
Yeah,
she was
yeah.
alive. Like she's great and she's healthy and she's wonderful. I think the way you just described sort of those secondary and tertiary layers, like that was the grief I experienced, right?
Yeah.
Like this idea I had of what my life would look like, I'm going to have this quintessential mother-daughter relationship, or I'm going to be able to sustain my career as a mother, or, just we're going to go on all these idyllic family vacations. And that all felt decimated in those
Yeah.
first days. I remember her father and I are divorced now, but we were married when she was born. And I remember looking at him and he was like, we'll never go on vacation. And like, that was real for us. Like in all of our fear and misconception of life with Down syndrome, like that was one of the things that we thought was true, that we would never go on vacation. We would never have fun. We would never, it turns out she's an amazing traveler. She's actually 1 million times easier to travel with than my son. So yeah, like,
but those things are all valid, like at that
right.
moment, whether they
Yeah.
are true or not. They are deep feelings that you had about, this vision that you had for the future and what your family was
That's
going to
right.
look like and do. Yeah.
Yeah. I grieved hard and it felt very conflicted because here I
Mhm.
had this baby that, I also loved very much and felt an urge to, accept her as she was and all those things. But it was really tough. So yeah. So anyway,
Oh,
I'm just,
thank you for sharing that.
yeah, well, you're sharing all of the things. So I will say, as an aside, one of the things that I was most excited about when we connected and bringing you on the show is, it's called Pragmatic Alchemy, and my coaching practice is called Alchemy Behavioral Health, and that word is extremely intentional and important to me because I believe very much in this idea of meaning making. Right? I subscribe highly to the works of Viktor Frankl, and I really do believe that in like the worst, hardest, ugliest, shittiest things that we experience, we do have the capacity to find something in there, right? Almost like an anchor.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like witnessing you from the outside, and we don't know each other very well, but it feels to me like what you're doing is alchemy, that you are taking this awful thing that I'm sure you wish you never had to live through, and you're turning it into such a gift for other people. And that to me is like, well, that's all we've got in this world. Like, because we don't have any guarantees, right? People are going to die. We're going to experience loss. And it's like, okay, well, then what do you do with that?
Yeah, in fact, that is the only guarantee, that we will live and we will die.
Right. And so then we have to sort of make like, well, what does that mean then? Like, what are we going to do with
Yeah,
that? Yeah.
absolutely. I completely agree. And I think that meaning making, which, funny enough, is I believe, what is it, the sixth stage of grief?
The
From
one that
David Kessler.
I was going to say,
Yeah.
one of the ones they tacked on the end.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I will say yes, but with
Mm-hmm.
some caveats
Mm-hmm.
to
Mm-hmm.
that. I think because meaning making has been tacked on to the 5 stages of grief, there is an urge for people, in the heat of the moment to be like, what does this mean?
Right.
And I think it's an unfair thing to ask of people, or to assume that anyone could make such claims at such a
Mm-hmm.
time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The meaning could take a very long time
For sure.
to show up. And it, I think for me, before I experienced the death of Will, my partner, his name is Will. um, I assumed that meaning making was related to, what was the lesson in this? What was
Right.
I supposed to take from this situation?
Mm-hmm.
Why did I deserve this?
Mm-hmm.
And I've done a lot of work and had to reframe that understanding of what meaning making is.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, there has been alchemy in my process, but to be very, very honest with you, this, like, working on a book was a very self-serving thing in the beginning. And like you said, it was an anchor.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't know if I was ever going to do anything with it. I was just like, this is something that my brain feels good doing right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I will only continue to pursue this project while my brain feels good.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
in early raw grief, you take whatever you can get,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
in terms of what doesn't feel really uncomfortable.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and that has been this book for me. That also relates to, there are different ways that people grieve. There's a bit of a continuum. On one end, you have an intuitive griever, which is a much more like feeling based experience of grief.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of emotional expression. On the other end of that continuum is an instrumental griever. These terms are from Doka and Martin in their book Grieving Beyond Gender.
Mm-hmm.
And the instrumental griever is a much more cognitive experience of grief. Thinking first more than yeah. Hands up,
You
hands
put
up,
put me
hands
you
up
put,
for the cognitive grievers.
put me right to work in a grief experience. Like,
Yeah,
give me something to
exactly.
do. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so that I definitely like lean more towards that end of the continuum as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think I like to put this kind of asterisk with the book, in that I recognize that not everyone grieves that way. Not everyone will make a product of their grief experience.
Right.
Not everyone who loses a limb will then become a wildly incredible athlete that is celebrated.
Right.
And that's okay. It is very okay if you or someone you love has suffered an incredible loss and they just survive
Yeah.
for the rest of time.
That's right.
And I think that's a real, like, I feel very strongly about that. I feel a little bit weird to like be celebrated like for the book, although I'm very proud of the product. I also, want to recognize that I made the book because that's what my brain does.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
not everybody's brain works that way.
Mm-hmm.
But also too, an instrumental griever is more focused on problems. And what I saw was a problem. And that is what I've been able to focus on,
Right.
and create this resource for people who didn't have it,
Well, but it's
when my
interesting
loss
because
happened.
it seems to me like what you're saying in terms of your grief experience is exactly what you're coaching folks on in the support role, which is find the thing you're good at
Yes, you're
and do
right.
that.
That's a great reflection. Yeah,
Like, so
absolutely.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I always make the joke, or I don't know if it's a joke, but I always reflect on my daughter was born right after I finished grad school. And
Mm.
so for me, my instrumental grieving process was to learn everything I could about. I'm a walking database on Down syndrome. If there's anything you want to know, I can tell you. And oftentimes I'll be watching Jeopardy with my husband and there'll be a question that'll come on. Like, I studied political science in undergrad. So it'll be like a government question. And I'll be like, I used to know that, but now I know, atrioventricular heart defect. Like, now I know the rates of hypothyroidism in people with Down syndrome. So it's, but that was for me, to your point of like, what makes your brain feel good? What made my
Yeah.
brain feel good was gathering all of the information I could to start to make sense of this new life.
Yeah.
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 And I love that phrasing, like, to do what makes your brain feel good. Yeah.
Yes. I think
Because then
like,
that's everything. That anything. It's all possible. Right.
exactly. Whether, that like, I'm also a big proponent of building distress tolerance skills.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of those things is really becoming like in tune with what your brain and your body needs
Mm-hmm.
moment to moment.
Yes.
Um, and when you are in it, and going through the most raw, brutal thing about being human, that is grief.
Mm-hmm.
um, the best thing that you can do, and the best thing that others can do for you, is just empower you to go inward. And it's going to suck to be there, but yeah, find the things that make your brain and body capable of being in that space.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Which is a universal lesson.
Yes.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
that's I feel like that's so much of the work that I do is,
Mm,
working within kind of the contexts of mindfulness, and my lens does kind of skew towards Buddhist tradition and Buddhist thought, but it's that idea of just like, yeah, like bad shit's gonna happen. It's
it
gonna.
is.
I promise you. Can you just sit with it? Can you take care of yourself in that moment? How do you be a friend to yourself when you're hurting?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I honestly believe about grief that if we just gave it the time that it deserved, that
Mhm.
it is begging you to give it,
Mhm.
it's not going to make it any less painful. It's not going to make it any less uncomfortable, but it's going to make you better off in the long run.
Yeah, yeah. I think, and you definitely can tell me if I have this wrong, but I almost feel like it's that misconception that there should be an amount of time that it takes that leads
Mhm.
us to not giving it the time that it will take, because we're like, well, I should get over this in a set amount of time. There should be a container, right? Or there should be a timeline. And when there's not, then we're like, okay, well, then how do I get out of it? You know?
Yeah, absolutely. It goes back to our, our culture and our brains wanting these, nice, fancy, cute little boxes
Mhm, mhm.
to
In
put things
6 months'
in.
time, I'll be fine.
Yeah, I honestly, like, I was there. I was that person. I told my therapist that, like, after year one, when like I still felt incredibly shitty, like, I thought this direct quote, I'm quoting myself, like,
Mhm.
I thought I was gonna crush being a widow. Like, who says that? Like, but that was like my mindset, like, I see something and I will get it.
Yeah, you're
And
gonna be the best widow to ever widow.
exactly. What a horrible goal to have. But it's true that we have these like preconceptions, or like we're just, I think there's also a fear that if we surrender to our grief, that we're never going to be able to get out.
Yeah.
And it's actually, like, funny enough, like, once you do, like, once you just let yourself feel whatever feeling from the feeling wheel it is that you're feeling, it actually, like, it loosens its grip on you.
Yes, it does. Yes,
Um,
it does.
but you can only learn that through experience.
Right. Yeah, because I sure try to tell people that all the time, they don't listen to me. They sure don't listen. No, but I
Yeah.
agree. I always use the analogy of, if you go to the ocean, they tell you, like, if you get caught in a riptide, don't fight,
Mm,
float, right? And I feel
yeah.
like our emotional experiences are the same. Like, the more that we butt up against them and try to resist them and try to make them go away, it's almost like they fight back harder. And can you just surrender to it, just let it in and let yourself feel it? It does seem like it'll pass through you with a lot more ease. That, I mean, it's still going to suck. Like, nobody's saying that it's not going to still be painful, but it's like it takes the energy out of it. And so it just can be an experience that you have.
Yes, absolutely. And I think being able to do that too, like, you need the right environment for it. And some of us are not
Mhm,
privileged enough,
mhm, mhm,
speaking to like going back to my original statement of like being in these Facebook groups with widows who are feeling like abandoned and forgotten and misunderstood. Like, that in itself is already very uncomfortable. And then to ask them to, surrender to their feelings. Like that is a lot of work for one person to do. So if others are able to step in and say, hey, you are safe, I will protect you, like, surrender, I am here, I will not let you drown. What a gift.
Yeah. I felt
What
that in my soul, and I'm not even
Yeah.
like, but just to hear that phrase, like, that I got you, like, I felt that. Yeah. That's so
Yeah.
powerful.
And that's something that the bereaved don't often get,
Right. Right.
where you get, I know in the States it's even less than what we get with employment laws
Oh
in Canada
gosh.
in
Yeah.
terms of bereavement leave, but that's not
You're lucky
enough.
if you get 3 days here. Yeah.
Yeah,
Seriously. Like, it's terrible. It's
exactly.
terrible.
So, go back to like bashing capitalism, like that,
Yeah.
we need to give people the space and give grief the time it deserves to
Yeah. Yeah.
have that process of alchemy,
hmm hmm
to be able to do with it what our bodies need to do with it.
hmm hmm One of the things that you talk about on your website that caught my attention is you mentioned the shame roller coaster when you make mistakes.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about this idea of mistakes, what they could be, how people approach, tell me, just say more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I talk about the shame roller coaster and making mistakes in chapter, I believe it is chapter 7 of my book.
hmm
And I think a lot of people shy away from showing up for people they love, or saying something about, their loss, because they're afraid of making mistakes. They're afraid of making it worse.
hmm
And the reality of like being, I'm going to go full on Brene Brown right now, but the
Yes.
reality of like being in the arena in the heart wrenching, tornado of grief is that mistakes are going to happen.
Mm,
And the reality is that that you are making mistakes because you are willing to show up. You love someone more than your fear of making mistakes. And so my mindset and what I try and teach people is that if you are making mistakes, you're actually doing the right thing. If you
hmm
are not making mistakes, it means you're not in the arena. You're
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
close enough to your person that you are trying to support if you are not making mistakes.
Right. Right.
So, with that comes a really important self care piece, and that is being able to recover from your mistakes.
hmm
And I often find, just from my own personal experience, that when you make a mistake, I end up on this kind of emotional roller coaster where I keep replaying it over and over in my head, telling myself, I'm dumb. How could you have done that? How embarrassing. You've made it all worse. And, it's a roller coaster that has just gone off the rails. So, step one, I say, is get off that roller coaster as soon as you can.
hmm
And to do that, you can either, talk to someone that will listen and be like, hey, this is what I did. This is what I am feeling. Have them talk you down, or create like an affirmation in your head. And I advocate for using like, I'm here because I am love my person. And because I love my person, I'm going to make mistakes, and that's okay.
hmm hmm Yeah.
And repeat that as many times as you need to hear it. Like, I will make mistakes, and that is okay. I will make mistakes, and that is okay.
Right.
Just give yourself permission to make mistakes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and I think it's really important that people know that it's not your fault. Like, we are not taught how to show up for people who are grieving.
hmm
We don't talk about death. Death
At all.
happens in hospitals.
Yeah.
Death happens to old people.
hmm
Um, and in reality, that's not the truth.
Right.
Um, People die all the time for all
hmm
sorts of reasons, in all sorts of good and bad ways. Um, and so it's not your fault that you make
hmm
mistakes.
hmm
And just remind yourself that you love your person, and therefore that is why you're making mistakes. And I love telling this story. My partner Will was very, very dedicated to the gym. Very good looking man. And he used to say that, it's muscles are not made in the gym. They are built with proper rest and recovery after you break them down in the gym.
That's
So I like
correct.
to apply that to making mistakes as well. Mistakes are where we like break down those muscles, but it is in the rest and recovery afterwards where our relationships with other people really get strengthened. So if you do make a mistake, circle back. Say, hey, did you feel awkward about when I said this? Or I know I made a mistake here. I'm really sorry that I did that in this situation. Like, I'm like, how can I make it up to you? And like really be intentional about that apology. And it can take some time, but I firmly believe that our relationships do get stronger if we recover from our mistakes appropriately.
Right. Yeah. And I just keep thinking as you're saying that, like, maybe even just thinking about it, like, do I want to say the wrong thing? Like, be there, be present, but say the wrong thing versus having my person who's already lost so much feel more alone because I
Mm-hmm.
wasn't even there, and I think my mom had breast cancer about 14 years ago, and somebody very close to her kind of like never reached out like the whole time. And
Mm-hmm.
after the fact was able to say, like, I know I should have been there for you more, but I didn't know what to say. So it
Yeah,
felt safer to just not say anything. And I think that we do that in grief,
yep.
'cause we're like, well, I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't know what to say. I don't know how to say it. So I'm just going to like
Leave it
stay over
alone.
here. And now this person who's already just lost so much is now also losing their other people. And that just has to be so hard.
Absolutely. And that's part of why I wrote Grief Ally is
Hmm.
that I want to empower people to make the mistakes, to show up, and there's also some guidance about like what not to say.
That
Honestly,
was going to be
just
my
like
next question.
there's a whole chapter in there about cliches, what not to say, but
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
also what to say.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
there's a lot of misconceptions about like what you can't say. One
Hmm.
of them being like you don't talk about the person who died, when in fact the opposite couldn't be more true. Like
Right.
I love talking about Will. Will was my favorite person in the world. He still is one of my favorite people. Like if you have a story to share or something reminds you of Will, like I want to hear those things. I want to
Hmm.
hear about the fact that you miss him too and that I'm not alone in that.
Hmm.
Um and I think yeah, people definitely get hung up on the fear, and hopefully, if you read the book, that it can inspire a little more confidence that you can do this. You won't make
Hmm.
it worse. So
Yeah, yeah. No, I had read that some years ago, almost this idea of like keep saying their name because it
yes,
helps, you not you specifically, but it'll help know that you're not alone in your grief, right? Like, hypothetically say I did know Will and I'm able to say to you, "Hey, do you remember that time?" Like now that
yeah,
reminds you like you're not the only one carrying him with you. And I have to imagine
exactly.
that's such a balm. Mhm.
It is. It feels so good on your heart. Even if you didn't like know the person, like asking questions about what they were like,
Right,
what
right.
would they think of this situation. I was in Palm Springs for Veterans Day
Mhm.
uh last November, and I was with a friend, and Will was a military member in Canada. So I was like, let's go to the Veterans Day parade. And we watched the parade, and then this friend, like as we were like walking back to the car, she's like, "Well, what would Will think
Mhm.
of this parade?" And it was like she didn't know him that well. Like they'd spent a little bit of time together, but it was an opportunity to open up and like tell stories about his reflections on other military parades that like we had been on, and not that those are really important events or anything, but it was an important conversation to me.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I can totally understand why.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is there anything that you would wanna tell us about him? Is that
Besides the fact that he was drop dead gorgeous. And no, I already mentioned that part. No, he was wonderful. He filled all the gaps I didn't even know I had.
yeah.
Um, and I am grateful for the time that we got together, but I will always be ungrateful for the fact that we didn't get to spend forever together.
That sounds like a reasonable reaction. Yeah,
Yeah.
I have to say.
Yeah.
Are there any other, so we talked about the name pragmatic or the name alchemy. The other
Mm.
part of it is pragmatic. And part of that is like to really be able to equip people with kind of like takeaways that they can start utilizing immediately. And we've said a lot of things, but was there anything else? Like if there was one thing that somebody took away from this conversation, what would that be?
I think my biggest takeaway, and I mentioned this right off the bat, is that focus on where you can provide comfort and where you can make the person that you love's life easier.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think it just comes down to that. And those actions can be as simple as, cooking, cleaning, walking the dog, taking care of the kids, doing errands, to changing the culture so that there isn't this stigma when people want to talk about the people they love who have died.
Mm.
And so they don't have to, feel like they're only able to talk about those people when they're asked or
Mm-hmm.
with other bereaved people.
Mm-hmm.
That would also make their lives easier and more comfortable.
You mentioned stigma,
Mm.
and I'm curious, it's almost like there's a compounding harm to be
Mm.
identified as a widow
Mm.
as a young person. Did you experience that as sort of a complicating factor, or did that not really make a
Um,
difference?
yes and no.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's a great article written in the National Post, which is a Canadian publication, about what it means to be a young widow. So like a widow, like in your 30s.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a great phrase about like we're statistically insignificant. Not
Mm-hmm.
that our losses are insignificant, but there are just too few of us to
Mm-hmm.
really know anything.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I definitely have felt that. So in
Mm-hmm.
terms of like the community bit, like I have found it particularly difficult to relate to people who just have more life experience
Right.
than
Right.
I did, but have still, you know, lost something similar. And I
Yeah.
think that what has really, really been helpful to me, I could focus, and sometimes I do, on the fact that I feel um, like I don't necessarily belong anywhere. Like I find it hard to relate sometimes to my peers who are married and having kids and making life plans with the people that they've chosen.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the other hand, my widowed peers are approaching retirement, and I still have a lot
Right.
of life left ahead of me. Um, what has really grounded me is that everybody's experience is unique.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Everybody wishes for more time
Mm-hmm.
with the person that they lost.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, and also the fact that my support network is very robust and accepting and respecting
Mm-hmm.
of my life experience. And, we've navigated grief together, like
Yeah.
hand in hand, arm in arm, like they have been with me through this process. So I don't necessarily feel personally um, that I can't have the life I want in terms of being able to talk about Will, because we have done a very, very good job in making like what I need in my present and my future very, very clear.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And they respect that, and that helps for sure.
Yeah.
And I hope more people get to have that because of the work that I've put into the book.
Yeah, yeah. I would have to imagine that that would be the result. Yeah, it just kind of caught my attention when you were talking before about, the grief expert that you spoke with early on in your journey telling you to find a community and then being identified as clinically insignificant or statistically insignificant. And it's like,
Statistically,
hey, there's a catch
yeah,
22, right? Like, go find your
yeah,
people, but there aren't any. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, exactly. And it's also like I'm sure people who are widowed in like their 40s and 50s, like, probably feel a similar thing. Like nobody is quite like me.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and it's true. Like that is the truth of it. Like we are all unique as humans. And if you're
Right.
trying to find someone who is like exactly the same as you, it's like, it's pretty tough.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
But grief is grief.
yes.
Yeah. It's
Yes, it
universal.
is.
It,
It
yeah,
is.
I agree. One of the concepts of Buddhism that I love is feelings, experiences, emotions will often be described with the word the. So it's not my grief, it's not
Mm.
your grief, it's the grief. And I
Ooh,
love that idea of like, we all know it. And it might
yes.
show up a little bit different because it filters through our personalities and our life circumstances, but it is the grief and it's all the
Yes.
same.
Yes, I love that. Yes,
Yeah.
thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. Yeah. My pleasure. Did we miss anything? Was there anything else you wanted to say, or do you want to tell us where we can find the book? People can find your work.
Yeah, you can find more info about me at alybird.com. So
Yep, and
ALYBIRD.com.
I'll link it in the show notes too. So, yep.
Beautiful.
Yep.
If you want info about Grief Ally, helping people you love cope with death, loss, and grief, you can go to alybird.com/book. All the links are there to purchase it.
Mhm.
And you can find me on social media at the Aly Bird.
Awesome. Now, is the book out or is it pre-order?
It will be out on January 25th.
Okay. Yeah. And I think this episode will probably come out right around that time, maybe.
Okay, perfect. So you can
Yeah.
pre-order it,
Maybe.
or
Yeah.
you can have it right in your hands.
Maybe mid-February, but yeah, it'll be somewhere within a couple of weeks time of that release date. So we'll link to everything in the show notes so people can find you if they are interested in learning more about your work or picking up the book.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Courtney.
Thank you so much. This was such a great conversation, and I understand that hesitancy of like, oh, I don't want to be like praised for doing this work, but you are putting something needed and magnificent into the world.
Thank you.
So thank you.
Thank you.
We'll be right back. Thank you so much to Aly for taking the time to have this incredible conversation with us, for turning her losses into something to share with the world, and for writing this book. We talked at the end there about when this episode would likely come out, and I am a little bit off by a few weeks, but the book is available. If you check out the show notes, you'll be able to find out exactly where you can get it, where you can learn more about Aly's work and other resources that she has to share. If you have future topic ideas, guest suggestions, questions, or other feedback, please feel free to send it to me at Courtney@shineandsoar.com or fill out the contact form on shineandsoar.com/podcast. You'd think I'd have this all in one fell swoop now, but I don't. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you're listening. And if you love this content, please share it with a friend because they might love it too. We'll be back next week with a brand new episode. In the meantime, take care of yourselves and each